After more than 2 decades behind bars, Demetrius Terrence Frazier was executed by nitrogen gas in the late hours of February 6, 2025. He became only the second person in U.S. history to die by this controversial method, a process touted as painless, yet described by witnesses as anything but. His final moments weren't quiet. Witnesses say he convulsed, gasped, and twitched for several minutes, a sight that left even seasoned observers rattled. But what was he thinking as the mask lowered over his face? What did he choose for his final meal? And most haunting of all, what were his final words? Those last few sentences, they would tell you everything you need to know about the man behind the crimes, and we'll come back to them. Because this wasn't just about a death sentence. This was a case that crossed state lines, sparked legal debates, and forced two justice systems to reckon with one man's violence. He was already serving life in Michigan for the cold-blooded murder of Crystal Kendrick, when Alabama said, "That's not enough." They wanted him back. To answer for what he did to Pauline Brown, a 29-year-old mother of 4. Some called it justice. Others called it overreach. And when the gas hissed through that mask, America watched closely, not just because of how he died, but because of who he was when the end came. But to understand how Demetrius Frazier ended up there, strapped to a gurney, breath slipping away, we have to go back. Back to a quiet apartment in Birmingham. Back to 1991. Back to the beginning. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences, and the darkest corners of human decision. Hit the like button, tap the notification bell, and stay with us as we uncover the twisted path that led Demetrius Terrence Frazier to death row. Demetrius Terrence Frazier was born on October 29, 1972, in Michigan, during a turbulent period that would shape his future. His mother Carol raised him and his sister alone, struggling to provide stability in their household. The absence of consistent parental guidance became evident early in Demetrius's life as he frequently disappeared from home to commit petty crimes around the neighborhood. Social services intervened multiple times during his childhood due to neglect. The state's involvement highlighted the chaotic environment that defined his upbringing. Carol Frazier worked hard to support her children, but the demands of single parenthood often left young Demetrius without proper supervision. This lack of structure contributed to his developing pattern of criminal behavior. By his teenage years, Frazier had already encountered the juvenile justice system. He faced charges for carrying concealed weapons and violated probation for breaking and entering. These early offenses demonstrated an escalating disregard for authority and the law. The pattern of violation and punishment became a recurring theme in his adolescent years. The W.J. Maxey Boys Training School became Frazier's temporary home, a juvenile correctional facility designed to rehabilitate young offenders between ages 12 and 21. During his time there, he managed to obtain his General Educational Development GED, showing that despite his troubled background, he possessed the intellectual capacity to succeed. However, this educational achievement would prove insufficient to redirect his path. Staff at the facility noted his intelligence, but also observed concerning behavioral patterns. Frazier struggled with authority figures and displayed manipulative tendencies that worried counselors. His time at the training school provided structure, but it failed to address the deeper psychological issues that drove his criminal behavior. Upon release, Frazier returned to the same environment that had contributed to his problems. The absence of meaningful opportunities and continued exposure to negative influences meant that his brief period of structured living had little lasting impact. His mother Carol hoped that the experience would change him, but the underlying problems remained unaddressed. The transition back to civilian life proved challenging for Demetrius Frazier. Without the structure and discipline of the correctional facility, he quickly slipped back into old patterns of behavior. The GED he had earned and the vocational skills he had picked up behind bars offered little protection against the gravitational pull of the criminal world that had shaped his youth. It was during this vulnerable and volatile period that Frazier crossed paths with Pauline Starks Brown. Pauline lived a quiet, steady life in Birmingham, Alabama. At 40 years old, she was a devoted mother of 2 daughters and had recently celebrated becoming a grandmother. She worked diligently and maintained close bonds with her family, often serving as the heart of their tight-knit circle. The night of November 27, 1991, began like any other in Birmingham, Alabama. Pauline Brown had settled into her ground-floor apartment, unaware that 19-year-old Demetrius Frazier was walking through her neighborhood. The light visible from her apartment window would prove to be a beacon that attracted the attention of someone looking for an opportunity to commit robbery. Frazier noticed the illuminated apartment and decided to break in. He removed the screen from the window and climbed inside, beginning what he initially planned as a simple burglary. The apartment's accessibility from ground level made it an easy target for someone with criminal intentions. Once inside, Frazier searched through Brown's belongings and discovered a small amount of cash, only $5 to $10. The modest sum disappointed him, prompting him to continue exploring the apartment for more valuable items. His movements through the residence eventually led him to the bedroom where Brown was sleeping. The confrontation began when Frazier woke Brown from her sleep. Startled and frightened, she initially complied with his demands for money, retrieving $80 from her purse. This additional cash represented a significant sum for someone living on a working-class income, but it would not satisfy Frazier's escalating demands. The situation deteriorated when Frazier produced a gun and forced Brown to comply with his sexual demands. The robbery had transformed into a violent sexual assault, with Brown pleading for her life throughout the ordeal. Her desperation and fear filled the apartment as she begged Frazier to take the money and leave. Brown's pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears. After the assault, Frazier shot her in the back of the head. The sound of the gunshot concerned him enough to leave the apartment briefly to check if neighbors had heard the noise. When he returned, he found that Brown had died from her injuries. Rather than fleeing immediately, Frazier continued to search the apartment for additional money and even ate food from Brown's kitchen. This callous behavior after committing murder demonstrated a complete lack of empathy or remorse. He eventually left the apartment and disposed of the weapon, believing he had escaped detection. The crime scene remained undisturbed until Brown's absence from work triggered concern among her colleagues. Her failure to appear for her shift broke the pattern of reliability that had characterized her working life. Tyrone Mitchell's concern grew as the morning progressed without any sign of his coworker and friend, Pauline Brown. Their arrangement for shared transportation to work had been consistent, and Brown's absence without explanation was completely out of character. Mitchell knew that something was seriously wrong when she failed to show up for their agreed-upon meeting time. Unable to reach Brown by phone, Mitchell decided to check on her welfare at her apartment. He brought along 2 maintenance workers who could help gain access to the apartment if necessary. The group arrived at Brown's ground-floor apartment to find it eerily quiet. Their knocks on the door went unanswered, increasing Mitchell's anxiety about his friend's condition. The maintenance workers suggested checking the window, the same entry point that Frazier had used the previous night. When they opened the window and looked inside, they discovered Brown's lifeless body lying face down in the bedroom. The scene confirmed Mitchell's worst fears and revealed the violent nature of her death. The discovery traumatized Mitchell, who had expected to find his friend ill or injured, not murdered. The maintenance workers immediately contacted law enforcement, beginning the official investigation into Brown's death. The Birmingham Police Department responded quickly to the scene, securing the area and beginning their preliminary examination of the crime scene. The evidence suggested a robbery that had escalated into sexual assault and murder. Investigators found signs of forced entry through the window and evidence of the apartment being searched. The modest amount of money missing from Brown's purse, combined with the sexual assault, painted a picture of a crime that had escalated beyond the perpetrator's original intentions. The brutality of the murder shocked even experienced detectives. The crime scene analysis revealed that Brown had been shot execution-style in the back of the head. The positioning of her body and the evidence suggested she had been forced to comply with her attacker's demands before being killed. This information would prove crucial in understanding the sequence of events that led to her death. News of Brown's murder spread quickly through her workplace and neighborhood. The random nature of the crime created fear among residents, particularly those living in ground-floor apartments similar to Brown's. The Birmingham Police Department increased patrols in the area while beginning their search for the perpetrator. In the aftermath of Pauline Starks Brown's 1991 murder in Birmingham, Alabama, Demetrius Terrence Frazier was arrested and charged with capital murder. Despite the serious nature of the charge, Frazier was granted bond, a controversial decision that would later have devastating consequences. At the time, Alabama's pretrial system allowed for certain accused individuals to be released under specific conditions, and Frazier managed to meet the requirements. While awaiting trial, Frazier did not remain confined to Alabama. Instead, he traveled north to Detroit, Michigan. The move placed him hundreds of miles away from the jurisdiction where he was facing capital charges. Pauline Brown's death should have been the end of the violence. But it wasn't. What happened next, while Frazier was out on bond, would shock 2 states and leave another family shattered. If you're following this case and want to understand how a system meant to protect the public failed twice, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. The next chapter reveals how a 14-year-old girl became the second victim, and how her death could have been prevented. Stay with us. Once in Detroit, Frazier's downward spiral continued. Within months of relocating, he committed another violent crime. His path crossed with Crystal Kendrick. Crystal Kendrick, born on March 8, 1992, was just 14. The teenager had been living as a runaway, struggling to survive on the streets after her mother's abandonment and drug addiction had left her without stable family support. Before her mother's addiction took over, Crystal Kendrick was known as a kind and well-behaved child. People believed she had the potential for a better life. But as her mother's drug use worsened, their home became unstable. There were days when even basic needs weren't met. Social services tried to help, but with limited resources, Crystal often ended up without the care and supervision she needed. As a teenager, Crystal sometimes ran away. With no strong support system to protect her, she found herself in unsafe situations. On the early morning of March 8, 1992, her life took a tragic turn. Demetrius Frazier forced her into a vacant house in Detroit at gunpoint. The abandoned building was far from safety, hidden from the watchful eyes of the public and police. It was a place where danger thrived. Inside, Frazier told Crystal to undress. He set his gun down as he started to undo his pants. That's when Crystal made a brave decision. She ran. Despite the fear and danger, she saw a small chance to escape and took it. But Frazier quickly grabbed the gun and chased after her. He was determined not to let her get away. Crystal's brief moment of freedom ended when he caught up with her again and shot her, ending the life of a vulnerable teenager who had already suffered through abandonment and neglect. The discovery of Crystal's body in the abandoned house shocked the Detroit community. They found her shot in the head, a brutal end to a young life that had been marked by struggle and abandonment. Detroit police launched their investigation into Crystal Kendrick's murder with the urgency that such a brutal crime demanded. The murder of a 14-year-old girl during an attempted sexual assault represented one of the most serious cases the department could handle. Experienced detectives were assigned to pursue every lead and piece of evidence. The abandoned house where Crystal was found provided crucial evidence for investigators. The crime scene contained physical evidence that would later prove essential in building a case against Frazier. Forensic specialists processed the location thoroughly, collecting DNA evidence, fingerprints, and other materials that could identify the perpetrator. Witness interviews began immediately as police canvassed the neighborhood around the crime scene. The challenges of investigating a crime in an abandoned building in a high-crime area meant that potential witnesses were often reluctant to come forward. However, persistent detective work gradually developed leads that pointed toward Frazier. The investigation revealed that Crystal had been seen with an unknown male on the day of her murder. This information provided a crucial timeline for investigators and helped them focus their efforts. The description of the suspect, though limited, gave detectives a starting point for their search. Detective Monica Childs took charge of the investigation, bringing her experience and dedication to the case. Her methodical approach to gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses would prove crucial in eventually solving the crime. Childs understood that justice for Crystal required thorough and professional police work. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate crime scene to include Crystal's known associates and the places she had been seen recently. This broader approach helped investigators understand her movements in the days leading up to her death and identify potential suspects who had been in contact with her. Physical evidence from the crime scene underwent detailed forensic analysis. The ballistics evidence from the bullet that killed Crystal would later prove essential in connecting the murder weapon to other crimes. DNA evidence, still relatively new in criminal investigations, provided additional avenues for identifying the perpetrator. The investigation faced challenges typical of cases involving runaway victims. Crystal's transient lifestyle meant that establishing a clear timeline of her activities required extensive detective work. However, the severity of the crime ensured that resources were dedicated to solving the case, regardless of the challenges involved. Following Crystal Kendrick's murder, Detroit police launched an intensive manhunt for her killer. Detroit police apprehended Frazier, then 19, in March 1992, bringing an end to his brief period as a fugitive. His cooperation during the arrest contrasted sharply with the violence he had shown toward his victims. The capture provided relief to the community and to those who had been working to find Crystal's killer. Once in custody, Frazier was interrogated about his involvement in Crystal's murder. While being interrogated, he admitted to killing Pauline, surprising investigators with his confession to a crime they had not yet connected to him. This unexpected development linked two murders across state lines. The confession to both murders provided investigators with crucial information about Frazier's criminal activities. His admission to killing Pauline Brown in Alabama opened a new dimension to the case and required coordination between Michigan and Alabama law enforcement agencies. The multi-state nature of his crimes complicated the legal proceedings that would follow. Detective Monica Childs continued her investigation despite Frazier's arrest, working to build a comprehensive case that would ensure his conviction. Her thorough approach to evidence gathering and case preparation would prove essential in the prosecution phase. The detective's dedication to justice for Crystal drove her continued efforts. The arrest generated significant media attention, particularly given the age of the victim and the brutal nature of the crime. The community expressed relief that a dangerous predator had been removed from the streets, but the tragedy of Crystal's death continued to resonate with those who had tried to help her. On July 9, 1992, Frazier was charged with first-degree murder for the fatal shooting of Crystal Kendrick. He was also charged with raping 8 other women. The charges reflected the full scope of his criminal activities and demonstrated the pattern of violence that had characterized his behavior. The pretrial proceedings in Michigan focused heavily on the admissibility of Frazier's confession. His defense team argued that he had been coerced or misled during interrogation, particularly claiming that he had been romantically manipulated by Detective Monica Childs. They alleged that she had promised he would not be extradited to Alabama, where he could face the death penalty. The court ultimately ruled that Frazier's confession was admissible, rejecting his defense team's arguments about coercion. The judge found that proper procedures had been followed during the interrogation, and that the confession was voluntary. This ruling significantly strengthened the prosecution's case against Frazier. A Michigan jury convicted him of the murder of Kendrick in 1993 and sentenced him to life in prison. After his sentencing in Michigan, Frazier began serving his life sentence there. The Alabama proceedings against Demetrius Frazier for the murder of Pauline Brown began in November 1993. Unlike Michigan, which had abolished the death penalty, Alabama maintained capital punishment as a potential sentence for the most serious crimes. This difference would prove crucial in determining Frazier's ultimate fate. The trial took place in Birmingham, the same city where Pauline Brown had been murdered. Then in 1996, an Alabama jury convicted him of murdering Brown and recommended by a vote of 10-2 that he receive a death sentence. The conviction reflected the jury's belief that the evidence against Frazier was overwhelming and that his crime warranted the ultimate punishment. The prosecution presented a compelling case that included physical evidence from the crime scene, Frazier's confession, and testimony about the brutal nature of the crime. The combination of robbery, sexual assault, and murder met the legal criteria for capital murder under Alabama law. The evidence painted a picture of a callous killer who had shown no mercy to his victim. The sentencing phase of the trial focused on whether Frazier deserved the death penalty for his crimes. The prosecution argued that the brutal nature of the murder, combined with his pattern of violence against women, justified the ultimate punishment. The defense attempted to present mitigating factors that might spare their client's life. Pauline Brown's family members testified about the impact of her death on their lives and their desire for justice. Her brother Curtis Starks stated that the family was relieved to see Frazier convicted and believed he deserved the death penalty for his crimes. The family's support for capital punishment influenced the proceedings. Circuit Court Judge Mike McCormick formally sentenced Frazier to death on August 8, 1996, following the jury's recommendation. Frazier, serving a life sentence in Michigan after being convicted of murdering Crystal Kendrick, remained in Michigan's prison system while his Alabama death sentence worked its way through the appeals process. The Alger Correctional Facility in Michigan became Frazier's home from 1993 to 2011, where he served his life sentence for Crystal Kendrick's murder. During this period, he also faced the reality of his death sentence in Alabama, knowing that he would eventually be transferred to death row. The uncertainty about his ultimate fate remained a constant presence during his incarceration. The appeals process that began shortly after his Alabama conviction consumed much of Frazier's time and attention during his imprisonment. His legal team filed numerous appeals challenging various aspects of his conviction and death sentence. Each appeal represented hope for avoiding execution while also prolonging the uncertainty about his ultimate fate. Prison officials noted that Frazier generally followed institutional rules and avoided serious disciplinary problems during his incarceration. However, this compliance appeared to be motivated more by self-preservation than genuine rehabilitation. His behavior in prison did not demonstrate the kind of fundamental change that might have supported arguments for commuting his death sentence. In 2011, after serving 18 years in Michigan's prison system, Demetrius Frazier was transferred to Alabama's Holman Correctional Facility to await execution. For Frazier, the transfer represented a significant change in his daily existence and brought him closer to the reality of his eventual execution. The facility's atmosphere differed markedly from the Michigan prison where he had spent nearly 2 decades. Death row conditions at Holman were more restrictive than Frazier's previous incarceration. Inmates faced stricter security measures, limited movement, and the constant awareness that they were living under a death sentence. Legal proceedings continued after the transfer, with Frazier's attorneys filing additional appeals challenging various aspects of his conviction and sentence. The change in location did not affect the legal process, but it brought him closer to the execution chamber where his sentence would ultimately be carried out. The transfer occurred during a period when Alabama was refining its execution procedures. The state had been working to address legal challenges to its lethal injection protocol and was preparing to implement nitrogen hypoxia as an alternative execution method. These developments would later prove significant in Frazier's case. Fellow death row inmates at Holman provided Frazier with a community of individuals facing similar circumstances. The shared experience of living under a death sentence created bonds among the inmates, though these relationships were conducted within the strict confines of the prison environment. As 2024 turned into 2025, Demetrius Frazier's legal options had been largely exhausted. Governor Ivey has set a 30-hour time frame for the execution to occur, beginning at 12 a.m. on Thursday, February 6, 2025, and expiring at 6 a.m. on Friday, February 7, 2025. The execution date represented the culmination of decades of legal proceedings and appeals. Alabama was the first in the nation to utilize the controversial execution method of nitrogen hypoxia. Frazier's legal team filed appeals challenging the use of this relatively untested execution method, arguing that it could cause unnecessary suffering. The appeals focused on constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The nitrogen hypoxia protocol became a central focus of Frazier's final legal challenges. His attorneys argued that the previous 3 executions using this method had demonstrated problems with the procedure, including signs of conscious suffering by the condemned inmates. They requested modifications to the protocol to ensure a more humane execution. U.S. District Judge Emily C. Marks heard arguments about the execution method and Frazier's request for modifications to the procedure. The legal proceedings examined witness accounts from previous nitrogen executions and expert testimony about the method's effectiveness. The court ultimately rejected Frazier's challenges to the execution method. Frazier's mother, Carol, and friends and family made public appeals for clemency, asking Governor Whitmer to intervene and prevent the execution. These emotional appeals highlighted the human cost of the death penalty while acknowledging the severity of Frazier's crimes. The final weeks before execution were marked by desperate legal maneuvers and last-minute appeals. Each filing represented a potential lifeline for Frazier, though the likelihood of success diminished as the execution date approached. On February 6, 2025, at 6:36 p.m., Demetrius Terrence Frazier was pronounced dead at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility. It was the first execution in Alabama this year and the third in the U.S. in 2025. The execution marked the end of a 34-year journey from crime to punishment. Alabama carried out his execution Thursday, February 6th, making Frazier the 4th person executed by nitrogen hypoxia in the state's history. The execution process began at approximately 6:10 p.m., when corrections officers strapped Frazier to a gurney and placed a mask over his face to deliver pure nitrogen gas. Witnesses reported that Frazier appeared to struggle during the execution, showing signs of distress including grimacing and quivering movements. The nitrogen gas flowed for approximately 15 minutes before Frazier ceased all movement at 6:21 p.m. Alabama Corrections Commissioner John Hamm stated that Frazier lost consciousness quickly and attributed his movements to involuntary reactions. In his final statement, Frazier apologized to Pauline Brown's family and friends, saying, "What happened to Pauline Brown should have never happened." He also criticized Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer for not intervening in his case and expressed solidarity with fellow death row inmates, ending with, "Detroit strong." Before the execution, Frazier declined his standard meals but requested a final meal from Taco Bell consisting of a beefy 5-layer burrito, chicken chalupa supreme, beef crunchy tacos, chips and dip, and a Mountain Dew. He received visits from his mother Carol, his sister, and his legal counsel in his final hours. The execution drew mixed reactions from various parties. Governor Kay Ivey released a statement emphasizing Alabama's commitment to law enforcement, stating that rapists and murderers are not welcome on our streets. She expressed that justice had been served for Pauline Brown and her family. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall condemned Frazier as a monster who had left a trail of unspeakable violence, and stated that he had been fairly and appropriately punished for his crimes. The state officials maintained that the execution had been carried out properly and humanely. Curtis Starks Jr., Pauline Brown's nephew, attended the execution and described his aunt as an integral part of their family whose death had been devastating. He remembered her cooking, particularly her red velvet cake, though he admitted he couldn't bring himself to eat the dessert for years after her death. Frazier's defense attorneys criticized the execution and expressed disappointment that Michigan had not intervened to prevent it. They argued that the state should have protected one of its residents from execution, given Michigan's abolition of capital punishment in 1846. The execution concluded a case that had spanned more than 3 decades and involved multiple jurisdictions. For the families of both Pauline Brown and Crystal Kendrick, Frazier's death represented the final chapter in a long journey toward justice. The case highlighted issues surrounding interstate custody of death row inmates and the ongoing debate about execution methods. If you found this story compelling, informative, or important, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We cover real cases, real lives, and the impact they leave behind. Click the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.